welcome to Histoire en série en VO. My name is Marine Boyer and I'll be hosting the podcast today. Our guest is David Lipson. He is an associate professor at the Université de Strasbourg. Hello, David, and welcome back to Histoire en série. Thank you for joining us in English today.
Hello, Marine. Thank you for hosting.
David, your research focuses, among other things, on the links between politics and entertainment. It is easy to see why you would be interested in the mini-series entitled Colin in Black and White, which was released on Netflix in 2021. The show is about Colin Kaepernick, is an American football player, quarterback for the 49ers, who became known worldwide for his decision to take a stand, or rather to take a knee, during the national anthem, which is traditionally played before NFL games. David, could you start by introducing us to the series and the people behind it?
Yeah, sure. First of all, it's a mini-series that was released on Netflix on October 29, 2021. The showrunner is Michael Starbury, and it has Colin Kaepernick playing the narrator, and then there's another person an actor who plays Colin Kaepernick as a young boy, as a teenager. His name is Jaden Michael. And there are also two very famous actors playing his mother and his father. It's Mary Louise Parker, who plays his mother, and Nick Offerman, who plays his father. Those of you who know a bit about TV series, Mary Louise Parker played the lead role on the series Weeds, and Nick Offerman plays in the TV series Parks and Recreations. So this is a 6-episode limited series on Netflix, and if you look on the internet, it's defined as a fictionalized coming-of-age teenage drama, and it's based on his teenage years and what led him to take a stand against racial justice. So the first thing we can notice is that every episode has a different director. Episode 1, called Cornrows, has Ava DuVernay. Episode 2, called Quarterbacking, has Sheldon Candace. Episode 3, Road Trip, has Robert Townsend as director. Episode 4 is also directed by Robert Townsend, called The Decision. Episode 5, called Crystal, is directed by Angel Christie Williams. And finally, episode 6, Dear Colin, is directed by Kenny Leon. So what's, I think, very important to talk about is that this series was created by Ava DuVernay and Colin Kaepernick. So let me just say a word about these two creators. So as you mentioned at the beginning, Colin Kaepernick is a very well-known activist today. He was born in 1987. He's a biracial child. His mother is white, his father is black, and he was adopted by then a white family. Colin lived with his white adoptive parents for 4 years in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. And then the family moved to Turlock, California. This is an important part of his biography because he talks about how these are both places where there's a scarcity of Black people. So when he's either in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, or in Turlock, he really stands out as almost the only Black person in this area. So then he, in his life, he achieved initial success as a quarterback for the football team, the San Francisco 49ers. A word for those who may not be familiar. In America, when we use the term football, it means American football. And when we talk about European football, we use the term soccer. So he's a quarterback for the football team, the San Francisco 49ers. And in 2012, he takes the 49ers all the way to the Super Bowl. Unfortunately, they lose to the Baltimore Ravens, but he goes all the way to this championship game. So again, a bit of information for those of you who don't know what the Super Bowl is. It's sort of like the World Cup of American football, where you have the 2 finalists from each conference. So you have the AFC, American Football Conference, and the NFC, the National Football Conference. So that you have the winners of each respective conference, and then they arrive to the final game, which is called the Super Bowl. And the Super Bowl is a kind of a media mecca, if I can say so, of television for Americans. This is the TV show that has the highest ratings of the entire year. About 33% of the available TV viewers watch the Super Bowl. So if you think about the population that's of the United States, that's more than 100 million people who are watching this show. And it's also even become a bit, has some international exposure as well. So I know that in France, for example, you can watch it on Canal Plus and some other programs. So anyway, so he takes the 49ers all the way to the Super Bowl in 2012. But his claim to fame now comes from what happened in 2016, where he decided not to stand during the national anthem. So before each football game, the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner, is played. And normally, all the players stand with their hand over their chest and they sing the national anthem when it's playing. However, Colin Kaepernick at this moment felt that he had to do something different because he didn't agree with what was going on at America at this time with racial injustice. So he decided to sit down initially as a way of protesting. Later on, one of his, somebody who knew him, who's actually an actual veteran, told him that it would be more interesting for him to kneel, because when you kneel, it's a kind of religious position. It shows a certain reverence. You can think about somebody kneeling at a church. So he decided, he agreed with what this person said, and so from that moment on, he decided to, every time the national anthem would be playing, he wouldn't stand, he would kneel. So after a while, people started noticing that he was kneeling instead of standing. And when they asked him, he said, well, because he was protesting against racial injustice. Now, I remind you that Trump has just been elected November 2016, and he's going to latch on to what Kaepernick is doing and just magnify it, basically by going after him. And during one of his rants, he is seen on camera saying that we have to do something about people who don't respect the flag, and he calls people who don't respect the flag sons of bitches, and he says we should just say to them, "You're fired." And so, of course, you can imagine that this is picked up by the news, and this is going to make him even more newsworthy, polarizing. People are all of a sudden decide to start burning his jerseys on the far right, and of course, on the left, people are saying that he's an example, and so he's going to become a kind of activist icon. And the key moment is that at this time of his career, he's a free agent. When you're a free agent, that means that your contract has expired and you're up for grabs for whichever team wants to hire you, for the highest, the team that can put up the most money is a hot prospect in terms of his success as a quarterback. As I mentioned, he'd taken the 49ers to the Super Bowl just 4 years earlier. However, no team was willing to take the risk of employing him despite his status as a free agent. And a year later, in 2017, he brought a lawsuit against the NFL because he felt that all the owners had been colluding to not hire him on purpose. Of course, people imagine that the reason is that they didn't want to hire him because they were afraid of political backlash. They just, they didn't want to make waves. And so, as I mentioned, he became this sort of activist icon. Nike had an ad campaign that they rolled out on him, where we see him in the ad, and it says underneath, "Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything." So it's making a direct allusion to the fact that he took a stand by kneeling, and in this sense, it cost him his career. So that's Colin Kaepernick. Let me say a few words about Ava DuVernay. So she's an award-winning American filmmaker. I'd say award-winning. She's won multiple awards, an Oscar, a Sundance Award, nominated for other awards. She won a Peabody Award. So there's an entire list of the awards that she's won that's very, very long. She tends to make politically and socially committed documentaries. For example, the documentary 13th, which came out in 2016 about mass incarceration in the United States. She made the film Selma in 2014 about the Selma marches in 1965. And she also made the another miniseries on Netflix in 2019 called When They See Us, which is probably familiar to your listeners because it was episode number 4 of Histoire en Syrie in English. So that's a bit about these two creators of Colin in Black and White.
Okay, well, David, we understand from this presentation that this is a series that needs to be analyzed through its context, and both to with its immediate social context and political context with all the tensions and controversies during the Trump administration, but also with a broader historical context, the context of race relations in the United States. Could you take us through that?
Sure. In terms of the historical context, it's a very, very complicated history in America where I feel that America has not really come to terms with its past, and the issue of race is always present. So I could go back and just give you a brief historical reminder of some of the events that have shaped this. The first slaves were brought to the United States in 1619. America was still a colony back then. Slavery at that moment wasn't limited to just race. There were white slaves as well. But little by little, people who were white slaves, they could buy their freedom. And eventually, it came to be kind of de facto slavery based on the color of your skin. And so the slaves at that point were brought in through the slave trade were only blacks. And it became one of the major issues when the Civil War broke out in 1861 until 1865. It was the issue because at that point in American history, when slaves were, when states were admitted to the Union, they could either be, they had something was created which was called the Compromise, which meant that for every free state, there had to be a slave state. However, a bunch of new states were admitted in the western part of the United States, California, New Mexico, Arizona, and these new states wanted to be free states, and this was going to upset the balance of the previous free slash slave state balance. So that was one of the elements that was going on, and the other one was that Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, and Abraham Lincoln had suggested that he would perhaps end slavery. He didn't totally commit to doing it, but he suggested he would. So when he was elected, none of the southern states voted for him, but he was elected nevertheless as president. And from that moment on, the South decided to leave the Union, and they created the Confederacy. So this was the start of the Civil War. When the Union, so the North, won the Civil War, and after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, slavery was therefore declared to be illegal. Afterwards, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed in the United States, giving blacks free, setting them free, giving them citizenship, giving them free rights and all the benefits of the Constitution. However, that was sort of like in theory on paper, according to the law. In practice, in the South, it wasn't still respected because some of the ex-Confederate soldiers decided to dress up wearing sheets and wearing white sheets as if they were presenting themselves as sort of the ghosts of these past Confederate soldiers. And they created what was known as the Ku Klux Klan, and then they would terrorize the blacks in the South with lynchings and intimidation. So to such an extent that the North had to actually send an army down and occupy the South. And this was a period known as Reconstruction. This period lasted until 1877, when the North finally pulled out of the South. And of course, as you can imagine, when the North left the South, then the growing feelings of resentment re-emerged, and the South, little by little, set up what's known as Jim Crow laws, or black codes, which were basically a sort of de facto apartheid society, where there was segregation and public spaces were segregated. So, and there were rules for blacks and rules for whites. There was a school for black, and that at that point it was called colored. So you had like one school that was the sort of white school and one school that was colored. You could have a drinking fountain that was white and a drinking fountain that was colored. So, and of course you can imagine that very little money was invested in the colored facilities. So this had basically created an almost internal colony, where you have, as I mentioned, sort of apartheid system, and this remained. This sort of segregated society remained in the South all the way into the 1950s. Well, we could say legally until 1964, 1965, when the Civil Rights Acts were passed. And some major decisions were carried out. For example, in 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, which desegregated schools. It's a very important Supreme Court decision. And some other events like this happened. The 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, where a certain Baptist minister named Martin Luther King came to prominence. So the 20-year period, and then in 1964 and in 1965, these laws were passed, basically ending this period of Jim Crow in the South, giving blacks full rights. But still there was a sense of white resentment. There were some other events that happened. For example, there was in 1992, a man was pulled over named Rodney King, and he was beaten by the Los Angeles police for resisting arrest. Somebody caught this on camera. People saw it on the news, and it was really scandalous. You could see this person lying on the ground being beaten by 4 white policemen. But the most scandalous aspect was that later there was a trial, and an all-white jury acquitted the police officers, and a riot broke out in Los Angeles after this decision. So this was a major moment where when these things happen, there are huge riots. There was also the O.J. Simpson trial in 1994 that lasted several years. That also was it was interesting because in the O.J. Simpson trial, it was almost sort of like a backlash that the suspicion of the way the Los Angeles police and the way they acted led to this acquittal of O.J. Simpson, in a sense that there was suspicion. And again, it was a decision that kind of polarized the country. And then we can jump from the O.J. Simpson trial all the way to 2012 and the death of Trayvon Martin, who was a 17-year-old teenager who had been who was walking down the street in Florida wearing a hoodie, and a man by the name of George Zimmerman thought he looked suspicious. Zimmerman belonged to a vigilante group, and so he started he accosted Martin, and he started to try and rough him up because he thought he was dangerous, because he thought he was Martin fought back, and then because he started getting the better of George Zimmerman pulled out a gun, shot and killed him. And it turned out that Martin wasn't armed. The only thing they found in his pocket was some candy, and so this was this was sort of played into the same sort of pattern of racial injustice of these of an unarmed Black person being killed. Now Zimmerman was actually Hispanic, but he sort of like fit this pattern of this sort of like non-Black or white person killing an unarmed Black. And he was 1 year later, he was acquitted in 2013 because in Florida they have some out-of-date stand your ground laws that defend people who do this, because you can argue that he was acting in self-defense. Anyway, when Zimmerman was acquitted, the backlash was so intense that a group was created called Black Lives Matter, which is self-explanatory, which is to say that Black lives have worth, that they shouldn't be killed like this, and that there should be consequences when somebody is killed. And from the period of 2013 to 2016, that is when Colin Kaepernick took a knee, there have been numerous instances of police brutality and of other killings of unarmed Blacks like Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Philando Castile. So we can understand with this context of why Kaepernick felt that there was too much racial injustice, and why he felt he had to take a stand. I'm going to read you a little quote by what Kaepernick said to explain why he was doing this. "I am not going to stand up to show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses Black people and people of color. To me, this is bigger than football, and it would be selfish on my part to look the other way." So, and he said also when there were some high-profile slayings of these young Black men by police officers, Kaepernick also said, "There are bodies in the street and people getting paid leave and getting away with murder." And I might mention, if we continue sort of with the cultural history of what's going on in the US at this moment, in 2020, when George Floyd was murdered because Derek Chauvin placed his knee on his neck for 8 minutes, and until he couldn't breathe anymore, people again took to the streets to protest. And one of the ways that they protested was to take a knee like Colin Kaepernick. So we see that his movement went from him personally to a kind of group movement of everybody doing this. So this is a kind of very long explanation for the listeners, but a very important for people to understand the resentment that has been seething and has been going on under the surface for years. So when Kaepernick approached Ava DuVernay and said he wanted to create a miniseries about his life, she her first thought was, oh, he's going to do it about taking the knee, and she was going on about, we're going to put the camera on his knee and there'll be a close-up of the knee, and he said, no, I want to do it about my teenage years and how I came to choose football. So I mean, so those of you who haven't seen the series, this is sort of like part of the themes of the series is, what is he going to do? Is he going to become a quarterback or not? So this is really what he wanted the series to be about, which was his teenage years. And what I think is really fascinating about the series is that it plays with the aspect of different elements. It plays with the hybridity of Kaepernick himself, a sense of in-betweenness. There's a lot of contrasting and conflicting elements, and there's really a sense of collage. I mentioned the fact that there's a different director for each episode, and Duvernay herself described it in the following way. She said, it breaks down into documentary, into graphics, animation, these little plays, little vignettes. This is like a collage of styles. So Duvernay herself sees this miniseries as this kind of collage. And one of the elements that for me is symbolic of this collage and is during episode 3, there's a kind of parody of it's basically what we see as a job interview, a white man interviewing a black man for a job. The black man has these very visible dreadlocks, but he's very chic, he's dressed in a suit, but he's got these dreadlocks, and we can see that the white man is a little uncomfortable with the dreadlocks. And the interview is, we see the interview as a parody of a play-by-play sports analysis of a football match. So it's very funny, we see the white man ask him a question, and he says, something about his hair, and then you hear all of a sudden a commentator, a narrator cut in and say, oh, look at that, he just asked him this question, let's see what his response will be. And then you hear the how the black man answers, it's very polite and says, well, I wear it this way, is that going to be a problem? And he says, oh my God, did you see the way he answered? So it's very funny. It's almost like this kind of football game, and the black man who's being interviewed has just scored a touchdown, and the person is reacting in that way. So we really have this strong sense of this collage, of this parody. At several moments during the video presentations, you see a bit of scribbling on it, almost like, again, the teenage aspect of like when you're a teenager and you're writing on your desk, or you're making graffiti or things like that. So it's visually very interesting as well. So unfortunately, this is audio, so I can't really show you. But if you watch the series, you'll get an idea.
Okay, well, thank you, David, for this historical reminder. That's absolutely useful for everybody. We understand then that so much is going on outside of sports and just athletics, but it is still a series about sports and how Colin Kaepernick became this great football player. And there is in the series a tension that is there, that is a tension between baseball and football. The fact that Colin has to face a dilemma that is exploited throughout the episodes between becoming a professional baseball player and becoming a professional football player. Well, we feel that it's more than just about sports, right? That something else is at stake here. Could you explain what this tension between baseball and football is about?
Yes, I think you're right to talk about the tension, and that there's more than just the two sports at stake here. As I mentioned, well, we all know what happened. We know that he in the end chose football, and that's how he became famous. But I think that he chose this moment in time is very interesting, because he chose a moment when he was really had to make a decision. In fact, episode 4 is called The Decision, which is whether he's going to become a professional baseball player or a professional football player. And in fact, I might also mention that there's also basketball in the mix, because he was a very, very good basketball player as well. But him becoming a professional basketball player was not so much on the radar as baseball and football. So what the series what we understand when we watch the series, and the way they present this dichotomous decision, is that baseball is going to represent sort of a rational choice that he should make. That means that if he chooses baseball, this is what would be logical. It's sort of like, if I were to say it, if it was symbolized by an organ of the body, it would be like the brain. Okay, it's logical to make this choice. He's going to have security. Not only is he going to have financial security, because there are already lots of offers to pay him millions of dollars to become a baseball player, even without even going through college. There are teams that want to draft him as soon as he leaves high school. He's going to also have physical security. Baseball is not a game where you come into contact with the other players. You're just hitting a ball and you're running around the bases. And it also is, I say but because I'm thinking about the fact that there's also peer pressure, which is that this baseball is seen by the outside world as the choice he should make. So everybody is telling him he should play baseball, and everybody expects him to play baseball. So there's peer pressure. And it shows how Kaepernick is really being seen by the outside world, which is that, of course, he's going to play baseball. That's what he's going to do. And so in this sense also, the choice of baseball represents a certain conformity, a certain collective decision, so that if you want to do what everyone says, if you don't want to make waves, if you want to fit in with a crowd, then you're going to choose baseball. Okay, so that's how baseball is represented. Now let's compare that with football. So football is going to be emotion. I said baseball was like the brain in terms of the organ. Football is going to be the heart. It's what he talks about as his passion. There's a scene where he meets with this person who's called Roger Theater, who's a specialist in coaching quarterbacks and in training quarterbacks, and so Roger Theater asked him, why does he want to become a quarterback? Because he has to decide whether he's going to accept him for his camp to train him. And Kaepernick, gives him a couple of, rational initial answers, which are, well, I work hard. And Theater says, yeah, whatever. Everybody wants to do that. Tell me why you really want to be a quarterback. And then Kaepernick, as a teenager, he goes deep into the real reason, and he talks about his passion, that he sees himself as this. He doesn't see himself as anything else. And that's how he convinces Roger Theater to take him and so that he can train in this camp. So it represents emotion. Football represents also risk. He has no contract. So financial risk. During the last episode, we see him trying over and over again to be a bit more well-known, to see if there's one of these colleges will offer him a scholarship and a contract. There's somebody on the news interviewing him during one of his high school games, and she says, so have you got any contracts for football? Why aren't you going into baseball? So he's everybody is sort of like putting this, sort of talking to him about this, and he knows about this risk in terms of the fact that he doesn't have a contract. But it's also physical risk, because when you play football, that means injuries. That means CTE, brain injuries. The career of American football player is shorter. You can have a serious concussion. So there's a lot more risk involved. It's we could say that it represents his inner world. So it's not the exterior world, it's his inner world. And it's not about how he's being seen by others, but it's how he sees himself. And we can say that it's more about an individual decision as opposed to a group decision. And in this sense, we can kind of tie it into the idea of protest, and even, the poem by Robert Frost, The Road Less Traveled, which is, I'm going to make my own road. I don't want to, do what everyone else is doing. I don't want to follow the crowd. So I think it's interesting because it links nicely into his decision to protest later on.
Yeah, indeed. Earlier you mentioned the concept of hybridity and in-betweenness, and I'd like us to go back to those notions, specifically when we consider the way the series itself is built, and it's very clear that the series is supposed to be both entertaining and educational. So could you maybe explain how the show manages to blend those two aspects together?
Well, as I mentioned, that there seems to be a very clear desire from the quote that Duvernay, the quote that I read from her earlier, to kind of blend different styles together. And I think what she's trying to do, what she and Kaepernick, I think, are trying to do is, on the one hand, entertain the viewer, but also educate the viewer. So we could say that in the entertaining the viewer part, it's very provocative, which is one of the means of entertaining people nowadays. In a way, it's kind of, in English we have the expression "in your face," which is used metaphorically, meaning kind of to provoke somebody. You can say that we could say that the series is really in your face, but we can also see that it's literally in your face, because the very first scene, the very first thing we see when the series starts is a close-up of Kaepernick's face. So it's like that sense of, his face is like 2 inches away from yours and he's provoking you. And it has, in terms of entertainment, also a very slick MTV video clip format to it. There's a wide use of music throughout all 6 episodes. Just in the first episode alone, there are lots of very famous songs being used, like "Work It" by Missy Elliott, "Area Codes" by Ludacris. That just, when you hear them, it's you recognize it immediately. The sequences are very short. Of course, we know that Americans have a very short attention span, but it's short because she wants to make sure that she's got your attention, that you don't get bored. There's lots of use of juxtapositions going from different environments. There are a lot of cut-ins to different elements. All of a sudden, we're in one place, and then it cuts to another. It's using also a very very well-known sitcom format, but as a sitcom for teenagers. So that's also something that people can recognize and identify with, which is very entertaining. So on the one hand, we have this entertaining aspect clearly meant to catch your attention. And then we have an educational aspect. So I already mentioned the fact that there's these cutaways. So for example, we'll be in the sitcom, and then all of a sudden we see Kaepernick as a teenager, and then all of a sudden Kaepernick, the adult, will cut in as a narrator, and then he'll start talking about Black history. He'll talk about I don't know, DJ Kool Herc and how hip hop was invented. He'll talk about Bearden, the baseball player who went on to do art. So he'll kind of cut in and start talking about these cultural references of Black history, and then even the vocabulary and the concepts are used, and are moments when there'll be these little pauses to talk about that. Things like cornrows, redlining, The term thug is there's a long segue where he explains the origin of the term thug and what it means and how it's being used by the TV media to refer to Black people. He contrasts that with the fact that maybe the behavior of Trump corresponds to the meaning of thug, but when white people do things that correspond to this meaning, like the rioters of January 6th who invaded the Capitol, they are not referred to as thugs, they're referred to as protesters. But when Black people, for example, Black Lives Matter, have a peaceful protest, they're referred to as thugs. He talks about microaggressions, a term that was created by a Black academic, which refers to these little innocent, quote unquote, statements that people can make, but that can have these sort of intended or unintended minor aggressions on people. For example, to say to somebody, where exactly do you come from? The meaning underneath that is, well, you know, you're not really American because your skin is Black. You must come from somewhere else. There's a very, in terms of the education also, there's extensive use of archival footage, historical archival footage, Nina Simone, footage of American football, footage of protests, movements. And so we have this kind of documentary aspect as well as the commentary and narration by the adult Kaepernick. And there's also kind of, at the end of each episode, there's sort of like a moral, and at the end of the series as well. So we have this aspect, this didactic aspect that has been thought out and deliberately put into the series.
So, David, you've already mentioned that Colin is having to deal with two different worlds, that he's in a position of being in between. You've already said that Colin is a biracial young boy, that he was adopted and raised by a white family, which is, by the way, not very different from the life story of former President Barack Obama, if that's relevant enough, but at all, sorry. But yes, what is interesting is that Colin is depicted as constantly torn between two worlds, the worlds of white people and the world of Black people. And there are a number of scenes in the series where we witness several conflictual and tense moments when those two worlds collide. Could you maybe dive a little bit more in this aspect of the series?
Yes, I think it's for me one of the most important aspects, and one of the most didactic aspects of it, which is that there seem to be two different worlds. First, there's this world that is inhabited by white people, which is sort of like a sitcom, but a sitcom from the 1950s, you know, kind of Leave It to Beaver. For those of you who don't know, Leave It to Beaver was a sitcom from the 1950s where about a child named Beaver Cleaver, who was, you know, he didn't have big problems. You know, everybody, it was a close family. Maybe he forgot to do his homework, or an episode would be based on that. You know, the mother was in the kitchen making the dinner. It was a loving family. Everybody was eating together. So we have this kind of like idealized sitcom atmosphere of the 1950s. Almost we can think about when Trump says, you know, make America great again, this kind of idealized period of the 50s. It's not a sitcom from the 1970s, for example, like All in the Family, or even later where you know, maybe characters have drug problems, or they have some serious things to deal with. They have minor problems, like I mentioned. His parents are white. His friend Jake is white, you know, so they live in this world. His mother wants him to go out with this the daughter of one of the neighbors who was a white girl. He wants Colin to take her to the prom, which is a kind of very important
annual dance at the end of your senior year, which, you know, you look forward to going to this dance called the prom. The world of that white people inhabit is the world that is portrayed as the kind of normal world, the world where everything is pure. People's hair is, you know, one's hair is straight. You are considered respectable if you're white. And it's a world of white privilege and power, you know, which is mentioned also in the series. They talk about, you know, audacity of whiteness, and so he's part of that world because, you know, his parents inhabit that world, and his friend Jake inhabits that world. On the other hand, you have another world, which is sort of the world that blacks inhabit. So that's the world where we have these excerpts of the socially committed documentary, you know, where there's these cutaways and we learn about Black history. This is a world of his friend Eddie. It's a world of a Black girl called Crystal, who he's really attracted to. In fact, the title of episode 5 is called Crystal. And it's all about Black aesthetics, the fact that she's different because she's not just Black, she's blue Black. That means very, very dark. And she has Black features. And so it's a world which is considered to be abnormal, where if you're Black, you're an outsider, you're different, you're the person who stands out, you're considered to be impure. The first episode is called Cornrows, so it's again this thing of Black aesthetics and Black hair. They're referred to as thugs, or as Trump said, sons of bitches. In the world that Blacks inhabit, there's always suspicion, there's always violence. They always have to deal with rejection. For example, in episode 3, we see a series of different we see Jake, his white friend, do something, and then we see Colin do the exact same thing, and we see the difference. So, for example, Jake goes up and asks for a second serving of ice cream, and he gets it, and then Colin goes and asks for a second serving, and the woman says, "No, I already served you." And then he tells this to Jake, and Jake says, "Oh, I'll go back there." And he says, "Oh, no, don't get me another, don't get one for me." And he says, "No, I'm going to get my second." So it's almost like a joke because he's going to go and get 3 servings of ice cream, whereas Colin only gets 1. So we have this idea that the Black world is totally different than the white world, and we get a sense as the viewer of this injustice because we see the difference. And of course, this is going to be shown in the most, I would say, emblematic scene of the series, the one that you can see on the trailer, which occurs in episode 3, where the name of episode 3 is Road Trip, and it's a series of road trips where he's taken to different cities in California to play baseball, to play these away games of baseball. But the thing is, these are really portrayed as sort of like in the backwaters types of cities, you know. Maybe this is going to be the first time that they see a Black person ever. So as they are driving, each episode starts with the father driving them out, and they go past a radar, you know, station, and there's a police officer with his radar gun, and in one, like the father even waves to the officer waves back, you know, and of course nothing happens to Colin's father. And then during one episode, Colin says, well, you know, his father lets him drive the car. And so we can imagine what's going to happen once it's Colin who's actually driving the car. So no sooner have they gone maybe a couple of miles than Colin is pulled over by the police officer. And the police officer immediately aggressively says, he comes to the car. Colin says, "Why'd you pull me over?" And he says, "I'll ask the questions." So it's already, it's like he pulled him over. That's the first thing. Second thing is he's already taking a defensive, aggressive sort of stance. And then at one point he says to Colin to pull out his driver's permit. So we see him, gently, because I saw that when you watch it, you see he goes to reach for his driver's license, and the police officer reacts as if he feels he's in mortal danger, immediately moves his hand down to his gun holster, and takes 2 steps back. This is very dramatic fashion. When we watch this on the TV series, we hear the music in the background, so dramatic music is playing. And we hear Colin, who sees his reaction, and we hear his breathing, which has increased, and how scared he is. His father at this point says, "Wait a minute, officer, he just wants to show you his, permit." And the officer says, "Okay, nice and easy." And we see him pull out his permit, and the police officer is taking it as he's standing far away. And then he hands it back to him. He looks into the car. He notices that his parents are white, and they say, "Well, he's adopted." And the father says, "Why'd you pull him over?" And he says, "Well, he was going a bit too fast." So it's interesting that when Colin asks, he doesn't get the answer. But when his father asked a similar question, he actually gets an answer. And when they drive away, you can see that Colin is visibly disturbed. He's visibly been affected by this interaction. And the first thing that his parents say, I think his mother says, "You dodged a bullet," in this kind of chirpy, joyful tone, as if for the parents, what they felt was at stake was just getting a ticket. Whereas the point of view of Colin as a Black boy was his life was at stake. So as I was saying, so we have the difference between literally dodging a bullet, meaning that his life is in danger, that he could have been killed, because there have been numerous instances of Blacks who've been pulled over for minor offenses like a broken taillight. And then all of a sudden, maybe they made a sudden move to get their driver's license. The police officer was scared and shot them. And it turns out that they were reaching for their wallets, and so he really felt that his life was in danger here. And his parents don't realize that, and they don't see that he's sweating and that his breathing has increased. So we see not only that they're living in a different world, but and there's a different aesthetic. For example, cornrows for one's hair, that he wants to get cornrows, and his mother doesn't understand why he wants to get cornrows. Okay, she goes along with it. But as we see I'm going to play a little excerpt when he goes to visit the female hairdresser at her home. I'm sorry, at the hair salon. We're going to see that it's not only a different aesthetic, but it's also a different language. So here's a little excerpt. Oops, sorry, it didn't start.
Yes.
And your mom? Yeah. You called me, right? You want me to bust Shorty like the boy AI?
Oh, no, he wants braids like Allen Iverson.
That's what I said.
Okay, so I'm not sure if I hope that was clear, that you were able to hear that. So what we see in that short excerpt is how the hairdresser says in a Black dialect, "Do you want me to brush Shorty like your boy AI?" And she says, "Well, no, we want him to get braids like Allen Iverson," not realizing that, in fact, and then she says, "Well, that's what I said." Okay, so she doesn't understand the language. So the language is so different that, it needs to be translated. this reminds me of a joke in the movie Airplane, where there's a white nun on the airplane, and behind her there are two black people speaking, in black English, sort of jive, and the people on the airline don't understand them, and so this white nun has to translate in black jive English for the flight attendant what they're saying. Anyway, so if you get a chance to watch this excerpt from Airplane, it's very funny. So it's the same idea that you have a different aesthetic and a different language. So and we can also see that Duvernay is kind of playing with this even visually at one point, and like I said, this is an audio, so I can't show it to you, but if you watch the you'll see in one episode, I think it's in the last episode 6, Colin is placed in between his white friend Jake and his black friend Eddie. So we see that he's spatially being placed between two different worlds. So this was to sum up, you can see how this in-betweenness and this hybridity is being illustrated, even so by audio, but also visually by Eva DuVernay.
Yeah, indeed. Then I guess to conclude, David, could you tell us, according to you, what are viewers meant to take away with them after watching this series?
I think that there are a lot of different conclusions. To answer that, also, I might also mention that when they were asked, because the question is about reception, DuVernay said that this was not meant sort of for their target audience was sort of like the people who are kind of in the middle, not necessarily somebody who's a fan of Colin. Of course, they'll like it and they'll enjoy the series, and somebody who totally hates him, they're not going to watch the series. It's sort of like maybe people who don't know anything about the series. So I would say that they're trying to educate and entertain this crowd of people who maybe don't know so much, maybe who have the wrong idea about why he's doing it. But it's also, for me, in terms of what I find interesting as an academic about the series is the way it explores tension, that is tension between the past and the present. So we have the period when he was a teenager. So he was born in 1987. So it goes from the age of 14 to 18. So we could say maybe from 2001 to 2005. And then the present day, because we see, I mentioned that it's a bit, it's not about the moment when he's an activist in the present day, because it's mainly about his teenage years. But there are scenes of him. They do actually show when he's kneeling, but it's only about 40 seconds in the first episode. But there is the sense of what's going on in present day America when Colin Kaepernick, the adult, the narrator, comes in and starts talking about it. There's this tension between cliche and surprise. So cliche meaning the things that we know that they're going to talk about. For example, I knew that the police officer was going to pull him over when he was a driver, and I knew there would be some kind of interaction, difficult interaction between the two of them. But surprise in the sense that excuse me, the series doesn't really focus so much on him as an adult, but on him as a teenager. And when you saw the title of the series, you would think immediately that it's just going to focus on that only. There's also this tension between indie and mainstream productions, because DuVernay is known to kind of do these sort of indie productions, but this is on Netflix, so it's kind of mainstream. I think the same way that she's combining education and entertainment, she's trying to maybe find a middle of the ground area so that to get people in the mainstream interested in the subject. if you think about the format of a miniseries, it's also something that's kind of like in between. You know, it's not exactly a film. A film would, in that sense, would be shorter. But if you compare it to a series, it's not really a series either. It's a mini series. So it's sort of like in between these two formats as well. So for me, in terms of what I would like to talk about as the most important thing that I think that you can get from the series is the notion of seeing and being seen. In episode 4, for example, Colin talks about this aspect. He says, I wasn't prepared to see how the world was seeing me. So we see the aspect first of him seeing himself, but then also the world seeing him. So I think this is a very strong reference to what W.E.B. Du Bois referred to as double consciousness. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the precursors for Black activism. He was the founder of the NAACP, which was an association for the advancement of colored people's rights. He wrote a book called The Soul of Black Folk, and he in that book he put forth the notion of the double consciousness. And I'm gonna read you a little excerpt from this book written by W.E.B. Du Bois. After the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with a second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One even feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So what we see in this quote is the idea of how the Negro in this time is torn between two identities. One, the identity of himself, of what he knows to be his own vision of himself, and the other, the vision of how other people, that is the white world, sees him. And this is especially important because the vision that the white world has of him is sometimes so different from his own vision, because we can say that everybody has a kind of double consciousness in this sense, meaning, you know, the way I see myself and the way others see me. But normally, there's not such a huge gap between the way others see me and the way I see myself. And so this is what's creating the conflict, and how that the way the white world sees Negroes, sees Black people, is as somebody who is very dangerous and suspicious and impure. So in the series, when these two worlds actually meet, we can say there is some kind of hybridity, some sort of mixing, some kind of blurring of boundaries, which can be, for example, that moment when his mother goes into the Black barbershop and meets these Black people. There's this kind of mixing, you know, and she's surprised for the very first time. However, when these two worlds are separated, then the two sides are not able to talk to one another. They're in conflict. There's a kind of invisibility or incomprehension, or microaggressions, violence, and rejection, which we saw when he's constantly being seen as somebody who's suspicious, or he's being rejected. For example, he doesn't get another serving of ice cream. In the first episode, we see that Colin is forced to cut his hair and to forego his Black identity. So we see again the conflict where he wants to strive for that world, but he has to give it up, and he feels it's unfair. So there's this idea of striving to know his Black world, and the episode ends with these words from Colin from the present in voiceover of the images, where we see the white woman at Supercuts cutting his hair, and he says, after that, I didn't get braids again for another 14 years. I never felt good about it. I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't have the knowledge, wisdom, or language to fight back. I couldn't rebel because I didn't know how. But now, okay, so now I know how. So with that statement, we can see that maybe the intent of the series is to say, okay, it's education. It's giving people the knowledge, talking about how he feels that he should go back to this identity. I would also mention, which is interesting, is that the TV series has takes a very clear stance on the message that they're trying to convey. It's a very political message about him going towards his Blackness. He is biracial, so we could say that, well, maybe he might want to go towards his whiteness as well. But it's all about him going towards his Blackness. So that's a very clear stance that they are taking. And so he is, as I mentioned, I see this as the goal is trying to stress the tools that people can use to fight back and to acquire wisdom and knowledge, and to understand how these words mean and how they're being used in a white world. And he says at the very end, in the last episode, he writes himself as an adult a letter to himself as a teenager, and he says in his letter, trust your power, love your Blackness, you will know who you are, sincerely, Colin. So that's the end of his letter. And then the very last thing that we see in the last episode is the words, to the underestimated, the overlooked, and the outcast, trust your power. So I think this is the overarching message that the series is trying to project. And I think it's a beautiful message. The series was criticized by some because they felt, though they liked parts of it, that maybe the message was a bit heavy-handed. But what I would say is, well, I invite everybody to watch it, and I'll let you decide whether you feel it was or not. So that's my conclusion. And I'd like to thank you again for giving me this opportunity to speak about this series.
Well, thank you, David. It was very enlightening, and we are looking forward to having you for another intervention, if that's what you would like to do.
Yes, thank you. I would very much like to talk about another TV series.
Okay, well, till later then. Thank you so much, David. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Retrouvez-nous sur Twitter @Histoire en série pour connaître le programme à venir ainsi que des conseils bibliographiques.
Travel logistically, such a beautiful planet populated by a strangely animals. And there's so many